Welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, Charlie. Lovely to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. We're exciting to dive into your brain and get all the knowledge that we can about journalism today. And we've had loads of questions and we're loving it. So, yeah, very excited. Just to start, then, so that the young people can know who you are and can get to know who you are a little bit better, could you tell us about your career journey and then what it is you do now?
I'll have to tell you the summary version because my career's been going on for rather a long time at this point. I did a degree in English and I then went on to do a master's after teaching abroad for a bit, did a master's in Latin American politics and economics. And I then went to work for the United Nations in Geneva on a technical assistance program in debt management. So as you can see already, my journey into journalism was quite circuitous. I then went to work for two investment managers, one in the City of London, and then I worked abroad in the United States, in New York and Connecticut, for what was then Citibank. I came back in the year 2000 and started at the Financial Times. And I went in at the Financial Times as a UK companies reporter, which was the way that at that time they brought in all new journalists to the paper. You worked first as a sub-editor and then on the UK companies desk as a way of learning the trade, learning the way the Financial Times worked, learning its habits, its customs, its ways of reporting. It was an absolutely excellent training ground. I then went on to do a range of jobs at the Financial Times, including working in the private wealth bit of the paper. I worked on the Lex column, which writes very short, pithy, 400-word comments on big news items of the day. I then, as you mentioned, ran the companies desk from 2008 to 2013. And that meant managing a team of about 46 journalists, reporters, both in the UK and abroad. The Financial Times has a huge network of reporters who are based abroad, which is relatively unusual nowadays and is one of the Financial Times' huge strengths. And also managing a desk of editors who are editing the copy that the reporters were feeding in. And I did that until 2013 and then became business editor, which meant writing and commenting on big business trends. So we thought at the time it would be writing about how business has become borderless and multinational. And then in 2016, something happened called Brexit. And a lot of my job became about writing about Brexit. And that was one of the reasons, in fact, why I took voluntary redundancy from the FT in 2019, and partly because I wanted to get some experience in with my hands-on experience in the world of business, which I've been writing about for many decades at this point. So I was then the founding chief executive of the Impact Investing Institute, and am now an academic, so a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics. But I think that those latter bits of my career are of less interest to your audience today than the journalism bit. So let's dive into that.
Yes, and we'll start with this next question, which is obviously journalism changes a lot. And, every year is going to be different. So, what skills do our young people need to develop? What's essential for those aspiring journalists to help them develop and grow in a future career in journalism?
So I was involved in the Financial Times graduate trainee scheme in choosing the young people who would join that scheme for many years. And it's quite interesting that it's still the case that people often approach a journalism career thinking that the skills they need are English A-levels or politics A-levels or English literature degrees, history degrees. Now, I'm not saying that those qualifications and skills aren't useful. They are extremely useful. But I think that what has really changed in journalism over the last 10 to 20 years is that there are some really different skills that make you incredibly attractive as a potential journalist. Those are very much around data analysis, around statistical skills, maths, um, uh, the ability to develop software that can analyze news or data sources for potential news stories. So there's a really what we started doing at the FT was, by the time I left, we were taking on what you might call traditional graduates, so with a background maybe in a journalism master's, maybe a politics degree, but we were also taking 2 data analytical trainee journalists who were coming from a background of data analysis or statistics or geography or some very different disciplines where you get some very different skills. And I think that mix of skills really reflects the way that journalism and how we find our news stories, how that has changed over the last particularly over the last decade, where you may be looking at one of the best stories I read was about fat in New York sewers, and an analysis of data collected by New York City Council on fat collection from the sewers showed which restaurants had the least good health and hygiene standards. And that is an example of, I mean, it's perhaps a little bit disgusting, but it's an example of how you're finding the news in places that, frankly, a couple of decades ago you wouldn't have been finding them. Now, that said, I also think it's quite important not to be too prescriptive about what skills and what particular qualifications you need as a journalist. The 2 most important things in journalism, the 2 most important skills you need to have are, number 1, curiosity about people, about places, about the way the world is changing, the way the world isn't changing and should be changing. And also it's the ability to tell a story. And you can tell a story now in journalism in so many different ways. I think it's so exciting. I feel very envious of people who are going into journalism now, because when I went into it 20 years ago, it was still very much you told your story in words. And I love words. I love telling stories in words. But you now can tell stories in so many different ways, in blogs, in podcasts, in videos, in charts, in on social media. And but the need and the desire and the ability to tell a story well, whatever the medium you choose, is an absolutely critical skill for all journalists.
And thinking about those kind of critical skills, then, how important is critical thinking when it comes to journalism? Because we hear a lot, and we're looking into, when you Google what skills you need, that's one of the ones that comes up quite a lot. Do you think that's an important skill? And if it is, how do you go about developing that? Or is it something that just comes with time?
Oh, I definitely think you can develop it, and it's an approach as much as a skill. And I think critical thinking is absolutely crucially important for journalism and has never been so important. And I can go into some of the reasons why I think that. And to be honest, I think it's critical thinking is incredibly important for whatever job or career, and indeed for your daily life, not just for your professional life. And the way I suppose I would define it is the ability to interrogate a situation, to really question whether you're bringing your own biases and prejudices to prejudge a situation, and having the ability to step back and really reflect on what is your neutral judgment on this story, on this event, on this person, and how are you going to tell that story fairly and in the most balanced way. Now, if I give an example of when I was on a bit of the Financial Times called the Lex column, which may give our audience today a bit of a real life sense of what I mean by critical thinking. So on the Lex desk, our job was, when a big event happened, so it might be a political event, it might be a big business deal, it might be a bit of a crisis, It might be, so an economic crisis, for example. We were then trying in one morning to develop a judgment that was worth sharing with our readers. And the way that a lot of us worked on the Lex desk is we would read the news story that described the event or the crisis. We'd then, and one of the wonderful things about working at the FT is we had access to, if you picked up the phone to anyone, everyone would take your call. So we'd then talk to experts. So I'd talk to maybe 3 or 4 or 8 or 9 experts on the subject I was writing on that day. I might read some analysis as well. But then what I would always do is I'd step up from my desk and I'd go and sit in a chair in a quiet bit of the office. And I'd just say, okay, let's just sit with this information now. Let's sit with it for 10, for 15, for half an hour. And then let me think, what is the fair judgment? What is the story, the balanced story that I need to tell about this? And I think it's that not rushing into judgment, which is really quite difficult to do, and particularly in an increasingly speedy world where we're expected to be able to react like this to things. It's having the courage and the confidence to say, hold on, I'm actually going to take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 hours, 10 hours to think this through really carefully. What do I actually feel? What is the right interpretation of this situation? And then so it's not that you're not taking in different sources of information on it. And people, as a journalist, everyone was more expert than I was. I was just a filter for other people's knowledge and experience and expertise. But to take that time and then to really make an effort to give a balanced view of the story. And I think it's doubly difficult to do that now because of algorithms on our social media feeds, we tend to only be fed information that the social media platforms believe we will already be in tune with or accept. So we're now fed what you might describe as a very siloed set of information or news stories. And you need to step out of your comfort zone. You need to go and ask the people who you think your knee-jerk reaction is, oh, I don't like this person's views, I don't like this person's approach. Fine. But as a journalist, it is your duty to set aside that personal prejudice and hear them out, listen to what they say, try and weigh it up. Is it correct? Is it factually correct? Are they bringing bias to it, which you can identify? So really listen to lots of different points of views, but also have the courage and the confidence to come out with your own view of what you think is fair and balanced.
Really interesting, and I'm definitely happy that we got to ask you that one because I think it's something that you just don't think about when it comes to journalism, especially, and I love you having an actual physical story that links to you and your own experiences using that skill, because it's so helpful to figure, oh, this is how that is used within this career. So yeah, really helpful to kind of get that visualization and hear that story. So thank you. Our next one is a little bit of a shift. Thinking about tools. Obviously, our young people are always thinking about how they can make their CVs better and what they can do. Do you have any sort of recommended tools or platforms that they can really get to know that will help them become more appealing, particularly, as technology advances and all this new stuff's coming in?
Well, I think that the problem is with any recommendation for the current platform or the current technology or the current software is that practically by the time I've said it, it will be out of date. And I remember, to put all this in context, I remember back in, wasn't even that long ago, maybe 2000, well, it'll seem long ago to the audience, but not to me, maybe 2006, sitting in an editorial discussion at the Financial Times and someone holding up their mobile phone like this, and it was a much clunkier version than this, and saying, in 10 years' time, everyone will read their news on this. And literally us all going, oh, come on, that's never going to happen. And now look where we are today. So the main, so it's a rather long-winded way of saying, I think the most important thing is to remain open-minded and curious about the changing platforms and technologies that are available to us as reporters, as editors, as journalists more generally, and keep an open mind about them. Be a little bit fastidious about how you use them, but keep that open mind, because that's the most important thing. I think, to be honest, a really fundamental skill is around what I was referring to earlier about telling stories. And I think that the most useful thing you can do at any age, whether that's 11, 15, 18, my age, is start telling stories in the forum that you have to tell the stories. Now, that may be writing something for your school newsletter or your school blog, or taking part in your school podcast. And now, if you're in the audience and your school doesn't have a podcast, doesn't have a newsletter, doesn't have a blog, start one. Get one going, and start contributing to it yourself with things that interest you, things that you're passionate about. And I'm not going to be prescriptive about what that is. That will entirely depend on you. It may be wildlife, it may be your community, it may be education, it may be a whole range of different things. Doesn't matter, but start telling those stories. And you might want to tell those stories as a written piece using those old-fashioned words, or you might want to shoot, we all have now, or most of us have with our phones, the ability to tell a photo story, to shoot a video, to record a podcast. We're so lucky now in the range of tools that are available to us for storytelling. But really start doing it now. I mean, I've got notebooks at home that have little stories I was writing when I was, I don't know, 8 or 9. If you want to, and if you don't want to tell stories, you don't really want to be a journalist, is what I would say. So, but many of the people in the audience, I'm sure, are storytellers. But don't hold back. Find opportunities to tell those stories now in whatever way you want to, and just keep going, because the more practice you get, the better you will get at it, the better you will get at selecting an introduction or the right image or the right graph to tell your story. So just do it. And if the opportunity doesn't exist for you currently, make it happen.
I love that came up naturally as part of that question, because my next question was going to be about telling stories. So you just answered that one within that. So I love it. So I'll move on to our next one. We've got 2 questions before we move on to our student Q&A. So almost time to get those student questions answered. And our next one question is, we've had a couple that have been submitted around this as well. So I think it's quite an interesting question and something that young people do think about. And it's about maintaining kind of ethical standards, or thinking about ethics in journalism, because I know that can be quite a hot topic. So, can you tell us a little bit about why it's important to have a standard of ethics, and to be aware of that while you're kind of navigating the career of journalism?
I don't think you can overstate how important those ethical standards are. And I think, very sadly, we live in a world where there are many examples of those ethical standards being breached. So I think it's a very important question, and also not an easy question. I think that there are a number of things that you can do to bolster and protect your own personal integrity. And I think, as a journalist, your personal integrity is unbelievably important. One of the things you need to do harks back to something we were talking about a bit earlier, which is about the people you talk to. You need to talk to as many people as possible, with as many different viewpoints as possible, so that you can reach the truth. And that's what we're trying to do as journalists. We're trying to tell the truth. And that means, seeking out the people that you disagree with and hearing them out. But it also means going to enough people. Part of the challenge in today's news environment is that we're all fed very carefully curated stories on topics that we are already interested in. And you get these real echo chambers of news now on whatever platform you get your information on, whether it's Twitter, X, or Facebook, or a number of Snapchat, wherever it is you're getting your information. It's not going to be unbiased and unprejudiced information. So you need to test that, and the way to test that in a journalistic context is to make sure that you've got a number of sources. And we had a rule at the Financial Times that we were not allowed to publish a story unless it had a minimum of 2 sources. And that sounds pretty basic, doesn't it? You would think that most news outlets required there to be 2 sources, i.e., you've not just got one person asserting something, someone else, and ideally someone who's, for example, not in their organization, not working with them, not connected to them, somebody else to say, yes, that's correct, that's also my understanding. Most news outlets now do not require what we call double sourcing at the Financial Times. And that to me is a real issue, because that means I can say something to you, Charlie, and you can just report it as if it was the truth, just because I've said it. And that to me is not that is too low an ethical bar. I think the second thing is to really to have confidence in your own judgment. And one of the things that's so exciting about working with young people and younger journalists in particular is that you tend to have extremely strong ethical standards of your own. You feel very strongly about what's going on in the world, what's happening with climate, what's happening with social justice. And that's amazing. And you can bring that self to your journalistic career and work as well. So if you think about the sort of standards that you would want applied to yourself and to the world that you live in, you need to apply those ethical standards to the stories that you're writing. I think it is also important. I mean, there are now so many ways of being a journalist independently. You can be just yourself blogging and you're a journalist. But if you go to work for an organization, query its credentials, test it. What are their sourcing policies? What are their oversight mechanisms? And this has been a huge topic in journalism over the last few years because of the phone hacking scandal, which some of you may be aware of and some of you won't, which was that it became apparent, and Prince Harry is in and out of court still, talking to sort of prosecuting the Daily Mail and others for phone hacking. Journalists listened in to private conversations between people on their phone, celebrities, politicians, the royal family. They did not have permission to do so. They reported stories appeared in the papers based on that unauthorized hacking of people's phones. Now, that was a huge scandal, and one of the upshots of the scandal was that something called the Levinson inquiry happened, and new institutional arrangements were put in place to oversee journalism and oversee journalistic activity. Now, this is a hugely controversial subject for journalists because we think we need to be allowed to act without interference. That is true, but allowed to act without interference, the phone hacking scandal happened. So getting the balance right between the governing and the governance structures at media organisations and independence and integrity of individual journalists is not easy. But whoever you go and work for, query those standards, ask what the governance structures are, see how transparent the ownership and oversight of the news reporting operation is. And that will allow you then to protect and maintain your own ethical standards.
Definitely. I think that was a really kind of well answered question, and we had some that have been submitted around that. So thank you for covering that one. The last one kind of leads on from that. It's very short and sweet, and you mentioned it, is about sources. So just to clarify for anyone who's not aware, what is a source? Why are they important? And how are they sourced?
So sources are where you get your stories from, or the people that you go to help you reach a judgment and write a comment piece or an opinion, what's often called an opinion piece. So when I was a journalist, my sources would be people running businesses, people analysing businesses, people in politics, people in Number 10, civil servants. So your sources can be from anywhere, and they also don't have to be people. They can be documents, or they can be, as we were talking about earlier, increasingly data. You can mine data as a source of news incredibly effectively. The way you use your sources is fundamental rule of journalism: you protect them. So people should understand that when they speak to you, you will respect them, and that often means that, but not always, but often means their anonymity. So if someone speaks to you on condition of anonymity, you respect that anonymity. And there are a range of sort of terms on which you engage as a journalist. So there's on the record, which means if you tell me something, I can report whatever you say. There's off the record, which means I don't report what you say, but I use the information you've given me to inform my reporting. And then there's something that we call deep background, which is I haven't even met you, but I've spoken to you. And those can be useful sources, although you need to be very careful because often they're used by people with an agenda. And I do remember Dominic Cummings coming into the FT and speaking to us on deep background, and he had an agenda. So you need to be careful, but so you need to respect your sources. You also need to treat your sources accurately. And one of the worst mistakes that's made in journalism, and it happens the whole time, is that I report what you tell me. You are my source. I report what you tell me wrongly, factually incorrect, or I misrepresent you. So you need to respect your sources in every way in terms of factual correctness and also in the spirit of how you've communicated with me.
Great, thank you for answering that. That's the end of our formal, and we're going to move on to our student questions. So all of these questions have been submitted to us, and we'll start with one that has come in live, and I like this one. And it's coming from a class of year 9s, and they've asked, how did you figure out what you wanted to do?
I don't know that I ever did. My dad said something to me very early on, which is that your career is often a matter of serendipity, so luck and opportunity, and the most important thing is to work with people you like and respect. And there's an awful lot of truth in that. I mean, I think one of the really difficult things, and I think it's more difficult for younger generations now than it was for me and my generation, is that you face a plethora of career choices and somehow you're expected to choose a path. Now, one of the best books I've read is called The 100-Year Life, and it's about the fact that people in school now are going to live much longer lives than anyone in history so far. And during those lifetimes, they will have probably 2 or 3 different careers. You may be a journalist for all your life, but you're much more likely to be like me and be a journalist for a bit of it and then do other stuff as well. So, and the most important quality that the authors of the book, The 100-Year Life, suggest you bring is openness to opportunities and not narrowing your choices, but leaving them open. And those years after school, those years from 18 to 28 or 30 are incredibly important, not for narrowing your choices, but for exploring lots of different choices, leaving yourself open to lots of those opportunities so that you can then decide what is the right route. And also, to be absolutely frank, it's luck. You know, things come along, opportunities come along, and all you can do in this life is plan about maximum 3 to 5 years ahead, and even that is pretty fraught with peril. If it's taking you in a direction in which you're learning, in which you're interested in the content, hopefully earning the money that you need to earn at that stage, and also working with people from whom you will learn and also who you respect, that is a great career choice, whatever it is.
Certainly. And our next question then has come in from Charles Dickens School, and they've asked, how can a sociology qualification help with a career in journalism?
Oh, I mean, it's enormous. It can help enormously. I mean, I think sociology is one of the disciplines that perhaps, when I was starting out in the world of work, it wasn't a natural route into journalism. And as we were talking about earlier, some of those more traditional qualifications would have, like politics or English or history. I mean, sociology is. I mean, I'm not a sociologist, so your audience may be able to correct me, but my understanding of the sort of skill set that you learn doing either an A-level or a degree in sociology is a lot of survey techniques, data analysis techniques, and just understanding the world in which we live in, and those are enormously important skills. What I would say is that as you're doing, so I'm just moving because there's sun shining on me, which is an unusual situation. What I would do is, if you want to combine a sociology qualification with a potential career in journalism, do keep on writing or keep on videoing or keep on podcasting. Keep thinking about how the work you're doing translates into storytelling.
Yeah, great. I'm going to keep going so we can get as many as we can in. We've had this question come in from a couple of different schools. So Summercoats Academy have asked it, and Ripton Grammar School have asked a similar question around kind of journalism and how it's affected by AI. I think a lot of people are worried about how AI can just write an essay, it can write, a blog post. So, how could it affect the future of journalism?
It's a hugely important question, so very glad that you've brought it up and that the schools have raised it. I mean, I tend to think of AI as an opportunity rather than a threat. And I think that I would remind the audience, when I started in journalism, we didn't have Google. So I didn't have a laptop. And every morning when I started writing my story of the day, I would be brought a folder of press cuttings on the company, for example, that I was writing about that day. And that was my Google. And that was only 20 years ago. So, I think how the world of work is going to transform over the next 20 years. I mean, honestly, you in the audience are going to be better at predicting that than I am, but I'm absolutely certain that AI is going to play an enormously important role. Now, one of the great journalists at the Financial Times, called Sarah O'Connor, she did a test, and you can Google it. She did a test, and I should say actually on that the Financial Times has free access for schools, and if anybody on this call, if their school doesn't have that free access, I can share with you, Charlie, afterwards, and you can share back with them the link to go to, because you can get access. Good journalism needs to be paid for, but there is free access for younger people, quite rightly. But she did a fantastic experiment where she tested herself against an AI journalism tool. It was a couple of years ago, so they weren't nearly as sophisticated as ChatGPT and things like that now. And they're very good. ChatGPT is very, very good, and it can write basic news stories, and you can feed in basic information. What it can't do yet is it can't do some of the things that we've been talking about in this discussion. It can't choose unexpected sources of information. It can't weigh up the ethical standards that should be used for reporting a story. So there are a lot of things that not only does it not do, but it's really dangerous that it doesn't do them. Now, I think that ChatGPT and all the other sort of versions of journalistic AI that will exist are actually going to help us with perhaps some of what you might call the grunt work of journalism. So, reporting the basic things that happen. What I think we will do as journalists is we will interpret, and we will bring our intelligence and our human judgment and our compassion and all the things that AI I don't think is ever going to have, we will bring that to our storytelling. And I don't think that's going to be replaced by AI. So I suppose in my fantasy future of journalism, AI does the boring stuff and we still get to do the really fun and important and, morally very important stuff as well.
Yeah, I definitely love that approach to it. Because I know many young people are scared about AI and how that's going to affect journalism if they're studying it. So definitely a great outlook to kind of approach, use it as a friend and a tool, and not something that's going to end the career and the industry as a whole, because it definitely won't. Our next question then has come in from Max, and they have asked, what educational pathway would you suggest is the best to get into journalism, specifically if you have any advice on the photojournalism industry?
Yes. So I feel very strongly that you must follow your passions, and you can't force yourself, you can't force a square peg into a round hole. There are now many, many different routes into journalism, and particularly into visual journalism, whether that's broadcast journalism, so television or photojournalism, or all the visual forms of storytelling. And I shared with Charlie before we went live, and I believe she'll share with the audience afterwards some of the websites where it shows you schemes and different ways in internships, work scheme programs, and then graduate programs that exist. So there are lots of different ways into it, and you need to develop your own passions and your own skills. It's quite important not to force yourself, for example, to do A-levels or a degree because you think it's a way into journalism, because there is no way into journalism now. Now, I would say the last talk I did to a school in person, it was about 100 A-level students. They were all English and politics. They were all doing English and politics and humanities in general. And I said to them, what I would do, if you're going the English route, add on some stats, add on some numbers, something numbersy. And for a lot, we still in this country have a, to me, really ridiculous division between, people who do the arts routes and people who do the science routes. And if you're going to do an English degree, try and do a stats module. If you're doing statistics, try and do a creative writing module. So I would, A, follow your own passion, but B, really, really try and keep your foot in both camps. Now, photojournalism, I'm afraid, I'm such a word person. I have no visual ability whatsoever. But I suspect that it's the same as my general advice, which is to get doing it now. Start developing your skills, telling a story through photos. I hopefully some of the resources we'll share after this talk can give you a more specific steer on that.
Yes, certainly. And yes, afterwards I will be sending an email with some links that Sarah has provided for me that will you can have a look through. And if you didn't sign up directly, ask your teachers who'll be able to pass these along to you. We have time for one or two more questions, if that's all right, before we have to end the session. We'll go for this next one, and I really like this one, so well done whoever submitted this. It comes from Charles Dickens School again, and they've said, sometimes I see a closed source said, especially when it's a gossipy celebrity story. Is it not possible that sometimes these are fully fabricated?
Yes, is the short answer, and I'm afraid we know because of and I expect some of you followed the Rebecca Vardy scandal. I mean, things are made up, and I'm afraid that some journalists do make up their information. And that's why when we were talking earlier about ethical standards, it's very important, most importantly, that you develop your own ethical standards and you stick to them. But B, if you go to an organization as a journalist, that you really test their approach to ethical journalism. And, if I went to my news editor and said, "Oh, I've got a fantastic story, and this, something quite radical, or interesting," my editor would say, "Okay, who are your sources on this?" And I would have to tell them. That didn't mean I had to publish them, but I'd have to tell my news editor who my sources were. And the more controversial the story, the more robust those sources needed to be. And quite often my editor would say, I want you to get a third source, or I want you to go back to that source and double check that and just delve into that a little more deeply. So I would expect in a responsible news organization, the editors to play that testing role. And I'm afraid in recent years, and probably not in recent years, I've just noticed them more in recent years, but we've seen some really egregious examples of that not happening. Martin Bashir and Princess Diana is another example. So yes, it is possible. Quite often, though, in those, a close source said, it is actually the celebrity's PR person. So it's more likely to be the celebrity's PR person than to be a fictional source.
That's very interesting. A little tidbit there. Wasn't aware of that one, but yeah, very interesting. And I guess that is right. It's on the journalists who write these pieces to make sure that they're following that. So yeah, really, really interesting. Thank you to whoever asked that question from Charles Dickens School. And our final question then has come in anonymously. And I really like this one, and it's quite simple. And it's, what's your favourite story or piece that you have written? And that could be quite a difficult question. I'm sure you've done it a lot.
I just love it. I love writing, and if you don't love writing, you shouldn't really be thinking about doing this as a career. But I've had it's just been an immense joy, and I still write as a journalist, and I still love it. So probably the piece I most enjoyed writing was the one I wrote when I left the FT, on what I'd learned from 20 years of writing about the city and about business, but the piece that I wrote that was the most read piece in 20 years of journalism was not about Brexit, was not about a business trend. It was about my decision to go grey. It was a decision for my hair to go grey. So that shows what readers thought was the most readable of all my pieces was about my hair colour.
I love the difference between what was most popular and what you really enjoyed.
Yeah.
That must have been a crazy piece, though, to try and write. How do you put what you've learned in 20 years into, a story that's readable? That's a lot of information, a lot of insights to narrow down. So it must have been a nice reflection piece for you to kind of round.
It was lovely. It was wonderful to have that opportunity. Yeah.
So we're heading to the end of our time today. Do you have any final thoughts or feelings that you'd like to leave our young people with before we end today's session?
Well, I think it is more difficult to get into journalism now than it was when I got into it. But I would encourage everybody who likes to tell a story to go out there, do it, go out into your community. There are so many little community news making endeavours, whether they're local radio stations, local newspapers, newsletters. I live on Exmoor down in the southwest, and we have a fantastic local newsletter. Contribute to it. There are so many opportunities. Delve into those opportunities and really make the most of them. And yeah, wishing all the aspiring journalists in the audience very, very good luck.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really wonderful having you on, and I've definitely learned some bits about journalism. And I've done, I've spoken to a few different journalists, and I love getting all those different insights and opinions. So hopefully our young people are feeling inspired and a little bit more knowledgeable about what they need to do and perhaps their future careers. So thank you for imparting that wisdom to us today.
Great pleasure.